thing whenever it happens. That's great. And have a good interview. And thanks for being here, Micah.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug.
All right. I'm going to count us down. Three, two, one. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Playful Podcast. We are in our Brave Voices series. I am a glutton for the Brave Voices. I can't get enough. And I've got another one here today. Micah Parzen, a longtime colleague here in the Southern California, San Diego area, and a really brave voice. So, Micah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kristine. Really happy to be here.
Fantastic. Now, I may have had an anthropologist on the podcast before, but unbeknownst to me. So now I know you are. So I'm going to ask you some questions about anthropology. But let me tell you, folks, that Micah is the CEO of the Museum of Us. Now, I grew up in San Diego where this museum is, and as a kid on field trips to Balboa Park, which is a beautiful park and cultural center of our town that was created for the World's Fair. This museum exists, and we would take the bus down there, and it was kind of like the old fashioned, stuffy, a little maybe musty, kind of, place where you saw old stuff. Kind of that's what it felt like as a kid. Great to have a place to go and to do some learning, but it wasn't as vibrant as it has become. And Micah, would you tell us about your leadership over it kind of originally and then more recently as you transformed it from Museum of Man to Museum of Us?
Yeah, sure. Well, gosh, I've been there 15 years, and the first day I started at the museum, I had never worked a day in a museum before. And so it was a very steep and humbling learning curve. But in many ways, it was a huge advantage because I didn't have a lot of baggage about the role museums should play in communities, who they were for, how they should be run. And I could sort of ask the dumb questions and not accept the answer that well, that's just how it's always been, or we never really thought about it. And so, when I first joined, the museum was as you described. We used to call it sort of grandma's attic, that it was a place that didn't really make sense. It was a mishmash of these old things. And over time, we started to really self-reflect as an organization. And we eventually, and it took a few years, came to realize that that grandma's attic, that collection of artifacts, as they're typically called in museums, the shrunken heads that were on display, the mummies, the human remains, all the things that the visitors would come to sort of, gawk at or
Mhm.
learn about, and maybe a weird combination of the two, you know, that history had caused an enormous amount of harm to indigenous and other communities of color. And, as we looked kind of further and further under the hood of that history, we realized we just had to do better as an organization, and we began to transform it. We began to focus on contemporary issues that are sort of vexing to our society and our community, whether it's race, immigration, indigenous lived experience, and slowly but surely we transformed it into a very different place.
Yeah, I want to talk a lot about that. And I know I did mention the anthropology, which I noticed on your LinkedIn profile has a fun and kind of mysterious description. It says, various locations, various contexts over 37 years. For those of us who maybe, I'm to speak for myself, I don't have much of an idea of that except for like out somewhere digging. What can you tell me about an anthropology story or experience that would round out? Obviously, I need a little rounding out what I think of what I know about anthropology and how that fits
Yeah,
into the work.
for sure. The beauty of anthropology is really the study of what it means to be human in all of its manifestations. So my perspective is by definition, we are all anthropologists. We
Mm.
are all engaging with people and analyzing their behavior and trying to make sense of it and understand how they make meaning. And so for me, anthropology has just been so baked into who I am as a person and my core values of trying to walk a mile in another person's shoes, trying
Yeah.
to understand them from a place of curiosity, not from judgment, trying to understand that we all do things differently, not necessarily better or worse, and that some things work better than others. Um, and so, for me, I just anthropology when I first took my first course in college, it just sort of blew my mind and opened up a whole new world and a way of engaging in a field of study. On the one hand, that I love, but also very much a philosophical orientation to the world. And
Yeah.
I've very much brought that to
Mm.
my leadership at the Museum of Us, and in terms of trying to transform an organization from the inside out, where
Yeah.
the internal culture of the organization really matches the work we're trying to do externally out in the world.
Okay, totally embarrassing. Guess what I did? I confused archaeology and anthropology. Did you notice that? Two long sciencey words that start with A. So that is like, okay, so and maybe that happens to people too. Maybe I'm not the only one who did that. I'm remembering that anthropology is more the observing, and it feels like archaeology is more the digging. And of course, both of those are obviously oversimplifying. I remember talking to some friends in our sector, in the social justice change sector, and they gave me an aha about the observation included in anthropology and how it can create an otherness, right? The observed and the observer. How do you navigate that, and what should we understand about that?
Yeah, well, first off, you weren't wrong by referring to archaeology, because in the United States it is considered a subfield of anthropology.
Okay.
But I think the beauty of anthropology, really, Kristine, is that um, the problems of anthropology, which are many, its history in terms of the colonial endeavor, its sort of otherizing kind of aspects, can be solved by anthropology, because it is such a self-reflective field that is constantly trying to peel the layers of the onion and sort of understand how one's subjectivity is impacting this sort of quote unquote scientific endeavor that's supposed to be objective, but saying it really isn't. And so, anthropology's main tool of participant observation, which is, when in Rome, do like the Romans, and, learn the subtle differences between a wink and a twitch. There's a famous anthropological kind of commentary by Clifford Geertz about, somebody has a movement in their eye, and unless you go into that deep, thick description, you don't understand the difference between a wink and a twitch, and yet they're totally meaningful in how you proceed in terms of interacting with that individual.
Fantastic. With the name change, which was kind of that's the the most obvious part, but probably in some ways the least significant. I don't know. I'd love to hear about that journey from Museum of Man to Museum of Us. Swapping out that one word. How significant, and what were the other ideas that you
Yeah.
recall from that journey?
Well, it really has been a journey. The museum was founded in 1915 as the San Diego Museum of Man. And of course, that was a very old school, sort of anthropological, one of the great museums of the Southwest that collected and otherized without thinking about the harm that we were doing. And, over time, once I joined the museum, we just started to change, and we started to value different kinds of things, and we started to be a lot more self-reflective, and we started to center anti-racist and decolonial work and equity and justice, and thinking about the role that we could play as an institution. And so the issue of the name had come up as early as the 1990s. In 1991 or two, there was a small group from the National Organization of Women who said, this is a sexist name. We need to change it. And the organization did all sorts of research and put it up to a vote of the membership, and eventually voted down a name change. And it came up again in the mid 90s, and it wasn't going away. And I knew that when I joined the museum. And finally, as we had sort of grown as an institution, we knew we had to grapple with that. And so, beginning in, I think it was 2017 or 18, we approved a process of exploring changing the name in earnest. And it took us many, many years. And it was really until COVID that we sort of got to the point where things were so topsy-turvy and people were adjusting to change so much that we said, let's go for it. And we considered a wide variety of names to adopt. Some of them were more evolutionary, like the Museum of Humankind or the Museum of Humanity, and others were more sort of radical, like, and I can't even remember some of them. I know one was the We, and it was
Mm.
like, join us at the We, and even transcending the idea of being a museum, right? Because museums are so old and stodgy and have all this baggage. And we ended up settling on the Museum of Us because it felt somewhere in the middle. It wasn't what our visitors or survey results indicated. People wanted a much more conservative approach, right? Incremental, change is hard. So we sort of pushed, we bended but didn't break. And we had this amazing response of love and support when we finally changed the name. I think it was August 2nd, 2020, in the midst of COVID. And there were also haters, right? People who really felt threatened and defensive about it. We ended up having a front page article on the local newspaper, the Union Tribune, as you know, and then Breitbart picked up the story.
Mm.
And soon after, we found ourselves the next day on Fox News and Tucker Carlson lambasting the name change as woke cancellation culture run amok and political correctness at its worst. And as hard as that was, because it sort of triggered that juggernaut of hate, and our poor staff had phone
Mm.
calls and emails and all the rest. It also was in some ways the best thing that happened to us, and that it allowed us to be very clear about who we are and what we stand for as an organization. And we've been going down that path ever since.
And if I may say, without the training, that sounds like quite an anthropological moment, that backlash, right? That's more
Mm-hmm.
observing, right? Observing that backlash, observing people feeling threatened. Why would somebody somewhere else in the country care what this museum is called? Well, they
Mm-hmm.
do, right? And what's that reaction to? And what can we learn about ourselves and them? And right through that. And I'm sure
Yeah,
you've done a lot of that thinking.
we have. That's a really good point, and it makes me think of sometimes when I can't sleep at night, early in the morning, I'll do what I shouldn't do, and that is I'll look at our reviews on social
Mm.
media. And if you do that, if you Google us and say reviews, you'll see we have tons of fives, that this is an amazing place, run, don't walk. It really challenged my assumptions and got me thinking in new and different ways. All museums should be like this. Or we have a lot of ones that are
Mm.
saying, this place is propaganda at its worst and woke culture and all the rest. And I was lamenting that with a colleague in the park one day. And, he said to me, you know what, Micah, I think that it really means you're doing something
Mm.
right, that either you're deeply resonating with folks or you're striking a nerve and making them defensive and reacting in that way. But isn't that the role that museums should be playing in our communities? And I thought, you know what, you're absolutely right.
I love that. And Micah, I'm guessing, and it was a different time and it wasn't as easy to state what you think about things, but I bet the old Museum of Man probably got a lot of threes, right?
Hmm.
You know,
Exactly.
yeah, like, it's fine. I don't really have
Yeah,
it doesn't bother me, but I don't, it's right? So
yeah.
hooray for the ones and the fives. And congrats on embracing it. Let's grab our ice cream because I don't want it to get too
Sounds good.
melted. And I'm going to ask you to turn the anthropological lens on yourself and talk to me about what's the scoop on how you came to care. But first, tell me what ice cream you chose out of the selection.
Yeah, well, gosh, you were so generous in sending so many pints. I had explicitly asked for mint chip, and I ended up getting this panoply of choices. And sure enough, after sampling them all, my favorite was the honey graham,
Oh,
which is to die for. I mean, it was just so good, and a good reminder, right, that we think we know what we like and what's best for us and all this, but sometimes when we have more of an open mind, we can learn a thing or two, right? So it's
yes,
a good
I did.
metaphor for life.
Folks, I do ask the guests in advance, any preferences on flavors, and then send those along. And I got to say, the generosity is only through me, but not mine. It's Taharka Brothers, our ice cream sponsor. Taharka, Taharka Brothers, based in Baltimore, a social enterprise, employee-owned company that I called out of the blue a couple years ago, and we've been doing this ever since. And so I chose Keep Your Head Up, and this is blackberry crumble layered throughout vanilla ice cream. And I will say, Micah, it's not scientific, but the honey graham has been, I think, the number one flavor on the podcast. And
Interesting.
do you want to say anything about how the graham cracker stays kind of like crunchy and how
Uh,
is that?
I don't know. It's just all sorts of ice cream goodness that, it surprised me because I wasn't expecting it to be
Hmm.
that good and to have the crumbles and all the rest. So I'm going
So
to take a
good.
bite.
So, folks, yeah, and Tarker Brothers does deliver nationwide, and as Micah can report, it comes in a hot pink box. It's quite a delight from the moment it lands on your doorstep. It has dry ice. It stays on the porch, okay, for a few hours, not days, and then you get to bring it in and enjoy. All right.
Delicious.
So, Micah, what is the scoop on how you came to care and sort of an early impact story? Where could you trace this passion and compassion that you've got?
Yeah, it's a really good question and one I'm not sure I necessarily cracked the nut on, but have thought about it. And I grew up in La Jolla, a very affluent community in La Jolla, as you know, Kristine. Um, and was very fortunate to live in this beautiful house. And we had a wonderful woman who was my nanny essentially, and she was 19 or 20 and was from Mexico. And I was the fourth of four boys, and I spent an enormous amount of time with her. And my mom had sort of been there, done that in a lot of ways. Not that
Mhm.
she wasn't a wonderful mother, but she had a partner in Terry. And one day, Terry and her husband, or soon to be husband or eventual husband, they would take me out from time to time. He would come over. He was her boyfriend at the time, and they would pick me up, and they would take me to 7-Eleven, and it was a special treat, and we'd get those old school candies, lickema sticks, and all that good stuff, and it was a really special thing for me. And um, one night, they took me out and we were on our way to 7-Eleven, and all of a sudden they told me that I needed to duck and put my head down. And instead of stopping and pulling into 7-Eleven, we kept going. And I looked over my shoulder and I saw that there was a police car nearby. And eventually I put two and two together that, they were concerned that they might get pulled over, potentially deported. And along those same lines, I've always, when I was young, I was a huge soccer player, and it's always been a big part of my life. And I used to play soccer at the La Jolla Rec Center when I was about 8 or 9 or 10, and that was sort of where I cut my teeth. And I played with a group of Mexican American guys who were out there, and at first they were sort of skeptical, and then they saw that I was actually, not too bad, and they would pass me the ball, and over time, I became a real comrade of theirs. And
Mhm.
one day the ball went out of bounds, and I went to go get it, and I turned to do the throw in, and everybody had scattered, and there was one or two guys, and I said, where'd everybody go? And they said, yeah, the police are here, and a lot of them don't have authorization to be here, and so they didn't want to get. And I think those kinds of experiences as a young person with so much privilege, trying to just understand the world, probably made a really important and significant imprint on me and my sort of path towards understanding my own privilege and how that can be wielded in harmful ways, and to try to learn how to do better and how to really be an ally for folks.
Yeah. I think that those two examples are so relevant at the moment as ICE raids and other tragedies, travesties like that are happening and now kind of playing out more visibly for those of us who wouldn't be normally affected by it. And I think, it's really interesting to watch again, observing, right, anthropologically, like observing, you know, even myself, observing my own sort of shock and then coming to understand that you've just now shared with me stories from decades ago. And again, like I don't think, my shock it could be helpful, right? But I got to remember it's just my shock because of my privilege.
Mhm.
Right. And so there's a lot there for us for further deepening of our understanding of each other and different communities' experiences and how we can be of support. Um, yeah, And I love that those two experiences, and this is such a through line with people on the podcast, created probably, I'm guessing, curiosity and then kind of desire to see if there's a role you could play in any of the injustice or imbalances that you were noticing or feeling or questioning. Might you be able to do something about it? I know you studied law and worked first as an attorney. Did that first show up in your work as an attorney?
Yeah, I think it did. I went into law school very focused on public interest law and mental health law in particular, and advocating for folks who struggle with mental health issues. And then I ended up kind of straying from that and got a job in a corporate law firm representing employers as an employment attorney. I think over time, I practiced law for about 7 or 8 years and eventually made partner at my law firm and realized that, that work was really eating away at my soul over many, many years. And um, that realization, and that, I always was sort of trying to bring an anthropological perspective to that work, eventually led me to the museum and to kind of double down on my commitment to devoting my professional career to nonprofit work.
Yeah. Micah, Playful Podcast, right? Bringing fun to the serious work of changing the world. That's our theme. That's why we're having some ice cream. In addition, I want to ask along those lines, how much of your goal is it to make the museum fun?
Mhm. It's been an interesting sort of tension, right?
Mhm.
Because many arts and culture experiences, people go to for a release,
Yeah.
right? To get away from the challenges of the day and the stresses, and to just listen to music or look at beautiful things, or engage in some other form of play. Um, we have really grappled with that because the topics that we kind of travel in are serious topics,
Mhm.
immigration,
Mhm.
harm to indigenous peoples through the colonial endeavor,
Yeah.
um, racism. So what we try to do is give people spaces in the museum where
Mm.
they have some moments of respite and reflection. And we try to prepare them that this is a place where we're going to challenge some of your assumptions. We're going to ask you to kind of do some hard work in terms of who you are and what you stand for and what's important to you and what feels right from a sense of justice.
Yeah.
Um, and we also realize that, our museum's not going to be for everybody, but
Mhm.
we're in the ecosystem of Balboa Park. And
Yeah.
if you're looking for a
Mm.
fun experience, there's 5 or 6 institutions within 100 yards that you could go to and have
Mhm.
that. And we feel like we play a very
Mm.
particular kind of role in the ecosystem.
Yeah. That the Smithsonian similarly, and I know it is under attack right now. So I'll talk about it, from my memory and hope for present future. But yeah, and the African American History Museum, does that thing you just described so remarkably. It's a full body experience, right? From the way the pathfinding, walking through the museum, and the feelings and experiences you have, and the chance you have to also step off the path, so to speak, right, while you're learning. Well, beautifully done. In Balboa Park, where there's all those different institutions, I know you've served in some leadership roles with the collective kind of group, and I know you're also a museum uh, expert nationally, and a leader. Tell us about how what you've done at the Museum of Us has created a platform, and how are you using it, and maybe even how are you using it, like, a couple years ago versus how are you using it now, because things have changed so dramatically in just this short time.
Yeah, we really refer to it as we have two parts of our work. One is our deepening work, and that is developing better and better practices in what an anti-racist and decolonial museum can look like. And then we have our amplifying work, which is creating a ripple effect in the museum field and beyond. And without the deepening, there is no amplifying, right? But we have found that we're very sort of different as an institution and very unique in that we've been doing this for a long time now. And we've really been committed to transforming our organization from the inside out. So we spend as much time on an organizational, cultural perspective and creating a culture of care, both among our team members and our board, and creating a space where people feel like they are truly welcome and belong and can bring their whole selves to work. And as a result, they thrive in the workplace and are more productive and engaged, and we retain them for a lot longer. And our I've often used this metaphor, Kristine, of when you're decide you're going to bake cookies in your oven, and the smell starts to waft out, and like maybe your neighbors who are busy doing their own things in their own way, they kind of catch a whiff and they come over and say, "Hey, what's going on over there? Like, how wonderful that is. It smells so great. Maybe I want some of that too in my world." And so over time, we've really been recognized in that kind of way, not as chocolate chip cookie bakers, of course, but as an institution that is doing museum-y things in a very different kind of way, a very holistic way, from the inside out, where we're really walking the talk
Yeah.
of our values, both externally and internally.
It reminds me of a great line in the 12-step world, in the recovery world, attraction, not promotion. It's
Mhm.
got that feeling of the smell of
Right.
brownies out on the street, right? You know, you
That's
don't have to
right.
like put up a sign that
Yeah.
says brownies. You're like, ooh, right, right. That's
And
beautiful.
we try to share with folks that like we made a lot of mistakes along the way, and learned a lot of lessons, and we continue to make mistakes, and hopefully those mistakes today are very different than the ones we made
Mm.
last year and 5 years ago and certainly 10 years ago, and that's really progress. And that we've had those learnings within our own unique context, our own history of harm as an organization, who we are, how we're navigating the space. But every other institution has their own history and their own unique pathway. But we do feel that, like, if the lessons we've learned can be helpful to others on their journey, then all the better, and the more we can transform the museum field as a whole.
Yeah. My firm Impactful, which is sort of the parent, so to speak, of the Playful Podcast. We do a lot of that kind of change work within nonprofit organizations, and we bring joy, play, and love as the centering of all the work, whether it's board development, which we call board development and delight, and changemaker camp and things like that. Always me too, kind of checking myself, especially kind of given any moment in this news cycle, which is so challenging. Contextually, am I coming, is it tone deaf? Is it coming across like how am I like kind of hit that note?
Mm,
It seems right now the appetite out there for rest, play, joy, rest is resistance, keeping our spirits buoyed, right? So we can do this work is very, very strong in our field. Now, you mentioned when I asked about making the museum fun, kind of threading that needle and kind of getting that right. Talk about as your leader, as a leader in the organization, and you just talked about sort of wellness perspective with your team. How do you bring joy and play into the workplace for those that are doing this, what can be hard work every day?
yeah, I appreciate that question because we certainly create spaces where folks can have fun, especially internally, and we do a lot of potlucks and barbecues and just arts and crafts sort of things that engage our team. Um, but I would say that while sort of fun and play don't have as a direct kind of manifestation in our work, I would say it's always rooted in love.
Mm.
That it is really about finding a path to relational repair.
Mm.
And that is so many people enter into workplaces and they've been in traditional environments where they often are toxic and they are literally traumatized. And they come to think of, work being a place where you have to hide yourself or act in certain ways. It's competitive. And so we've really worked hard to sort of create a very different kind of context along those lines. The same applies to organizations engaged in a process of repatriation, for example, to return cultural resources and ancestors back to indigenous communities. We really come from a place of love, not a transactional place, but a place where we are inviting folks into our home as if it is their home too, and treating them in ways that from the very beginning of the process tells the truth about the harm we've promulgated against them and their communities, um, holds ourselves accountable, apologizes for that, and says, we'd love to partner with you to do better. Will you help us do that? And you know, magical things happen as a result in terms of repairing relationships, and all of that is really driven by love.
Yeah. Love. I love that. I was thinking, the land back movement, the reparations movement, all of this fits into that. And I know a lot of our audience members are involved in those different things. How are you? We've spoken a little bit about language in terms of like name change and things like that. How are you navigating this moment where language is, lightning rod and on fire, and a lot of people are retreating, and that idea of, obeying in advance, which is a lot of folks are doing that just because it feels safer. I've got some folks on coming up in a couple weeks. The episode that we recorded last week, there's a risk assessment tool for nonprofits and nonprofit leadership to really test themselves out on their risk appetite versus just automatically assuming everybody's afraid to do this, and we'll just pull all those words off the website. For example, the words are emblematic and important. I just wonder how is this moment? How are you responding in this moment? Anything you'd like us to be thinking about
Mm.
alongside you?
Yeah, I mean, we are just staying the course,
Yeah.
not letting all of this sort of noise in the background distract us and um, dysregulate our nervous
Mhm.
system. We've really been focusing on what we can control, how we can continue to be true to who we are and what we stand for,
Yeah.
and what can we really accomplish despite the multifaceted and unceasing attack on museums and arts and culture institutions that even hit a crescendo this week, of
Yeah.
course. So language is critically important, and we changed ours years ago, and it started us down a path of really changing how we think and how we acted. We started to move from words like artifacts and collections,
Mm.
which are really giving primacy to the scientific endeavor and the folks, the anthropologists, the archaeologists, the hobbyists who took and often under very untoward circumstances, to say the least, these belongings. So we now call them cultural resources instead of collections.
Mm. Yes.
We call them belongings because it really honors the folks who made these items, who used them and imbued them with meaning. We don't refer to mummies and shrunken heads and all the rest. We talk about ancestors because for
Mm.
indigenous peoples, that's who they are. We don't talk about laboratories. We talk about housing rooms instead. So there's a wide variety of changes that we made early on, and it really shifted the way we thought about things, and that translated into the way we act. And essentially, that means that the holdings that we have, the belongings and ancestors, we treat them as living breathing beings the way indigenous communities would, and that we're holding them for the time being. But um, our objective is to return those
Yeah.
to the home communities where they really belong.
Wow. I just, you certainly have both learned a lot and taught a lot. I am certain in
Mm.
these last few years, especially, and our a student teacher in that mindset, I feels like that duality constantly. Let me ask you a couple final things that could be a little playful. I want to know, it sounds like soccer might still be a part of your life. What do you do to take care of your own mind, body, spirit?
Yes, I am a huge San Diego Football Club super fan. So they are in their inaugural year, as you may know, as
Yeah.
a new franchise in the Major League Soccer League. and I have season tickets, and they are just bringing me such joy. They're doing especially well and leading the division, and are in the running for the supporter shield and all the rest. So for me, that's a huge kind of release, and you know, a place where I can have a lot of joy. I love being outdoors. We have two dogs, and we go on walks on the daily of, you know, an hour a day, just early morning, getting down to the beach. And I love to read and just learn. And I'm very curious, of course. And I love my work. You know, I love building something with others that is unique and very special. And I'm also a big believer in rest. I'm more of an energetic kind of ebb and flow kind of leader, where sometimes I'm on fire and moving things forward, and other times I'm just sort of curled up in a ball and letting my body and my spirit and my soul kind of regain its energy.
Excellent. Tell me, if you would, for a call to action that I'll kind of prescribe and ask you to answer, fill in the blank, and then any other one you want to offer. What would be your kind of call to action to philanthropy, especially philanthropy in your space that's funding or could potentially be a supporter of cultural institutions at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the predicament that philanthropic organizations are in, and individual philanthropists in this moment, and how to help and how to do more. I think maybe the most important thing that I've learned over time, based on the museum's own journey of looking at the harm it's caused and how we can start to be part of the solution instead of continuing to be a part of the problem, has its own applicability in philanthropy, and that is really scrutinizing how wealth was accumulated over time and whose was harmed in that process. Most wealth didn't just fall from the sky in a way that does not have its own history. And so I think thinking about the communities that were directly harmed in that process or indirectly, and really focusing on using those monies to make it right by those communities. Is something that is difficult for philanthropists and philanthropic organizations to think about, because it really requires a lot of self-reflection and a willingness to embrace that sort of difficult and dark history, whether it's a museum or the accumulation of wealth that ended up in a philanthropic fund of some kind. It's much easier to sweep that under the rug, and that's what museums have done for evermore, and that's what philanthropy has done, as you know well, with limited exceptions, right? So I think continuing down that path is critically important.
Most of the CEOs I have on don't have a place where we can invite everyone to, but you do. So
Mhm.
for sure, when people are in San Diego, check out Museum of Us over the next, say, fall of 2025, early 2026. Anything specific coming up in terms of exhibits, moments in time? If someone was planning a trip, plan around that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. In mid-November, we are opening a new exhibit that has been years in the making. It's called Race, Power, Resistance, and Change. And particularly in this moment of erasure and whitewashing of history, it will tell the story of race in a truthful way from the 1700s to the present. But it does so by really exploring what we sometimes refer to as the universal and the particular. So it focuses very much on how white supremacy and wielded its ugly head in our community and region, how Indigenous and other communities of color have resisted that oppression, and then pathways for positive change. So it really looks at the specifics of our region, but in doing so, it also is very universal in that, yes, it's our story along the border with
Yeah.
this Indigenous community, the Kumeyaay and Pamunkeychum nations. Um, and there have been all these manifestations here, but in many ways, if you rise to that 30,000-foot level, this is the story of every community, and every country, and every kind of context that is grappling with racist and colonial harm.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. So in November, is there a specific date we should even be aware of?
Yeah, it opens November 14th to the
Okay.
public. It is built around, I think, 10 or 11 contemporary art pieces by BIPOC artists who are kind of showing, not telling. There is certainly interpretation and all the rest, but it's just going to be a much needed and amazing exhibit that will be come our signature offering here at the Museum of Us.
Wow, fantastic. And I know your website is also really robust and will, for those of you who aren't here yet and before you get to San Diego, check it out online because a lot of the learning and inspiration that Mike has just shared is very evident on your website as well.
Mm.
All right, so thank you. Now, I ate way more ice cream than you, and I also think, well, I've been making you answer a lot of questions, so I didn't give you a lot of chances to take bites in between. So feel free to enjoy the rest of your carton. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for the work you're doing in your leadership, and I will definitely, I've got it in my calendar. I'll be down there, and I'll let you know when I'm in the building.
Would love that, Kristine. Thank you for having me. It's really been a pleasure. I'm a big fan of your work and really appreciate who you are and what you do in our community.
Thanks so much. All right. Have a good one, everybody. Keep bringing fun to the serious work of changing the world.